Hello, friend. Welcome to Science for Sleep. Tonight, we are beginning with something small enough to rest in the center of your hand. A cookie does not usually seem mysterious. It feels familiar. Flat or rounded, crisp at the edge or soft in the middle. It often arrives with a warmth that seems to soften the whole room around it. There may be sugar on the surface, a little shine where butter met heat, or the faint scent of vanilla, spice, or toasted flour still rising from it. For many people, cookies belong to ordinary comfort. They wait on kitchen counters, in lunch tins, on holiday trays, and beside cups of tea long after the day has begun to quiet down. And yet, cookies have not always been what they seem now. By the end of the night, we will have followed cookies much farther back than the dessert plate, into their older world of ovens, spice, travel, trade, and memory. We will see how they began in humbler forms, how they changed as sugar spread, and how something so small became one of the most familiar comforts in human life. The version most people picture today is sweet, gentle, and clearly a dessert. But the deeper story is older, stranger, and much more practical. Some of the earliest ancestors of cookies were not desserts at all. They were simple baked foods made to last, to travel, or to test the heat of an oven. In the ancient world, people baked hard flatbreads and dry biscuits that could survive long journeys far better than soft loaves could. Later, in 7th century Persia, small sweet test cakes were likely baked to check whether an oven was ready before a larger cake went in. What we now call a cookie may have begun as a quiet little signal of heat and timing, not as a treat. Medieval bakers also made spice-baked goods that were medicinal, ceremonial, or meant to be eaten slowly with wine or ale rather than saved for the end of a meal. So one of the soft questions drifting through tonight's journey is this one. Have cookies always been desserts? The answer, it turns out, is no. Not always. Sometimes they were fuel for the road. Sometimes they were tiny experiments in heat. Sometimes they were remedies rich with spice, prepared for the body as much as for the tongue. One medieval nun, Hildegard of Bingen, became associated with spiced cookies meant to lift the spirit, filled with ingredients like cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg. Long before the cookie became a simple symbol of sweetness, it was already carrying many different meanings. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you're welcome to subscribe. And if it feels natural, to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. It helps others find their way to this calm corner of the world, one sleepy traveler at a time. The quiet continues here, just as it is. For now, all you have to do is imagine a tray resting on a counter as evening deepens. The cookies there may look modern, but behind them is a long line of hands, ovens, grains, spices, and small decisions repeated across centuries. A baker watching fire, a traveler breaking a dry biscuit at dusk, a monastery kitchen scented with honey and clove, a market table lined with spiced rounds in winter, a home oven glowing softly, while butter and sugar begin to brown. That is part of what makes cookies so calming to think about. They are simple enough to know at a glance, but deep enough to hold a very long human story. Flour, fat, and sweetness are only the surface. Beneath that surface are trade routes, old languages, changing ingredients, and the slow work of people learning how heat transforms dough into something firmer, richer, and more fragrant. So tonight, as the edges of the day grow softer, we will stay with this small and ordinary thing for a while. We will follow it backward, before the word cookie was even there, into the older world of breads, cakes, wafers, spices, and travel food. And from there, little by little, the shape of the modern cookie will begin to appear. Before cookies had their modern name, they already had older relatives waiting in the background. If we go back far enough, the familiar round dessert begins to blur. In its place, we find small baked things that were rougher, simpler, and made for very different reasons. Some were hard and dry. Some were lightly sweetened with honey. Some were twice baked for travel. Some were closer to little cakes, and some were closer to bread. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, people baked early flatbreads on hot surfaces using the grains they had. These were not cookies, of course, but they belong to the deeper story because they show how old the idea of a small portable baked food really is. A flat piece of dough was easier to cook than a large loaf. It needed less guesswork. It could be carried more easily. It could dry out and last longer. In a world where ovens were simple, fuel mattered, and food needed to survive heat and travel, that kind of practicality meant everything. As agriculture slowly expanded and kitchens became more varied, these small baked foods began to change. Honey could sweeten dough. Nuts could be ground and mixed in. Spices, where available, could turn something plain into something ceremonial. In ancient Greece, there were honey cakes offered in sacred settings, small sweetened foods that were already beginning to move away from pure survival and toward ritual and pleasure. In Rome, there were twice-baked breads and biscuits made to keep for long periods. These hard, dry foods were useful because they traveled well and resisted spoilage better than softer baked goods. That older world matters because it reminds us that cookies did not appear suddenly as a perfect dessert. They emerged from a long tradition of people solving basic problems with dough, heat, and time. How do you make food last? How do you carry it? How do you portion it? How do you use a small amount of sweetness or spice when those things are costly? The answers to those questions help create the conditions that cookies would later grow out of. If you pause and picture these early ancestors, they do not look much like the cookies most people imagine today. There is no tray of soft chocolate chip rounds cooling by a bright kitchen window. Instead, there are stone floors, low ovens, baskets of grain, and the sound of hard crust breaking apart in the hand. There are honey cakes shaped by fingers rather than scooped with metal tools. There are dense little baked pieces meant to be dipped, carried, or stored. Even when sweetness enters the story, it enters slowly and unevenly. It also helps to remember that our modern food categories are much tidier than older ones were. Today, people like clear labels. Bread is bread, cake is cake, a cookie is a cookie. But in older kitchens, those lines were much softer. A small sweet baked food could be understood as a biscuit in one place, a little cake in another, or simply a baked treat with no single fixed category at all. Some early foods we now describe as cookie-like would not have been recognized that way by the people making them. They were simply part of the wide family of small baked foods that sat somewhere between bread, cake, wafer, and biscuit. That is why the history of cookies begins with a kind of uncertainty, And that uncertainty is useful. It keeps the story honest. Instead of searching for one exact first cookie, it is better to imagine a slow change unfolding across centuries. Simple breads become more varied, sweetness becomes more common, small cakes become more refined, dry travel foods sit beside festive honey pastries, and somewhere inside that broad and shifting world, the cookie begins to take shape. So before the cookie became familiar, it was part of something older and larger. It belonged to the long human habit of making small baked things for need, for ritual, for travel, and sometimes for pleasure. And once those humble forms were already in place, only a few changes were needed for something more recognizable to appear. In the next part of our journey, we will move closer to one of those changes by looking at why people kept baking small things at all, and how practicality may have quietly helped create the first real cookies. From there, the next part of the story becomes surprisingly practical. Long before cookies became symbols of comfort, they made sense for simpler reasons. Small baked things were useful. A large loaf or cake asked a lot from an early oven. It needed steady heat, enough fuel, and enough confidence that the inside would cook before the outside burned. A small piece of dough was less risky. It baked faster. It used fewer ingredients. It gave the baker more control. In older kitchens where heat could be uneven and timing depended more on judgment than on precise measurement, that control mattered. This is one reason the old story about oven test cakes has lasted so well. In 7th century Persia, bakers are often said to have placed small bits of sweetened dough into the oven first to judge the temperature before committing a larger cake or batch of bread. Whether every detail of that story can be proven with certainty matters less than what it reveals. It shows how natural it would have been for a cookie-like form to emerge from ordinary baking practice. A tiny piece of dough could do an important job. It could tell the baker whether the heat was ready. It could brown quickly, reveal the mood of the oven, and spare the larger bake from failure. That image is easy to picture. A dark oven mouth. A baker leaning in. A small piece of dough set near the heat. A pause. Then the surface begins to color. The baker watches the edges first. If they darken too quickly, the oven is too fierce. If the dough sits pale and lifeless, the heat is still too low. In that moment, the small baked piece is not a dessert. It is a message. And even beyond oven testing, small baked foods offered other advantages. They were easier to portion. A household could stretch limited ingredients more carefully. Instead of committing all the flour, honey, butter, or sugar to one large item, a baker could divide the dough and make many small ones. This made sharing simpler too. A tray of little baked pieces could be handed out one by one, packed for travel or saved over time. Small size made food flexible. Fuel also matters here. In much of human history, cooking heat came at a cost. Wood had to be gathered. Fires had to be tended. Ovens had to be heated with care. Small items baked more quickly, which meant less time spent holding steady heat. In some cases, baking many small things may have been less wasteful than risking a large one that might fail. A small biscuit that dried well and lasted for days could be more useful than a richer loaf that spoiled sooner. Then there is the matter of travel. Hard, dry, baked foods survive motion better than soft ones. They can be wrapped, stacked, and carried over distance. They break perhaps, but they do not collapse. They may not feel luxurious, but they endure. This helps explain why so many early ancestors of cookies belong to the world of journeys, roads, ships, and stored provisions. A twice-baked biscuit, a dry little cake, or a firm sweetened round could serve as food that waited patiently until it was needed. Small baked things also fit social life in quiet ways. They were easy to pass across a table, easy to make in groups, easy to serve with wine, tea, or ale, easy to shape with the hand, easy to sweeten just slightly when sweetness was rare and valuable. A very large cake makes a statement. A small biscuit can slip into daily life much more easily. That may be part of why cookies remain so adaptable for so long. Their size let them move between worlds. They could be practical or festive, plain or spiced, dense or delicate. They could belong to a monastery, a market, a caravan, a winter gathering, or an ordinary home kitchen. The form was modest enough to survive many changes. So before the cookie became a treat, it was already a very sensible idea. Bake something small, let it cook quickly, let it tell you what the oven is doing, let it last, let it travel, let it be shared without ceremony. In that sense, the cookie did not arrive as a grand invention. It emerged almost quietly from the ordinary logic of baking. And once that logic was in place, one ingredient began to change everything. Sweetness, once rare and precious, slowly became more available. As sugar moved into more kitchens, the small practical baked piece could begin to turn into something gentler, richer, and more recognizably close to the cookie we know now. That change begins most clearly in Persia, where one of the earliest sweet cookie traditions seems to have taken shape. Earlier small baked foods had often been plain, sturdy, and practical. In Persia, they could begin to move in a sweeter direction because sugar itself was becoming more available. This mattered more than it may seem at first. Sweetness had existed long before this, of course. Honey had been used in many places for thousands of years, and fruits could bring sugar into breads and cakes in a softer way. But sugar brought something different. It could be measured, concentrated, stored, and mixed into dough with a new kind of precision. A baker no longer had to rely only on honey's flavor and texture. Sweetness could become a more deliberate part of the structure of a baked food. Persia was one of the first places where this shift seems to have become especially important. By the 7th century, sugar was no longer only a distant luxury in certain kitchens there. As sugarcane cultivation and sugar use expanded, bakers had a new ingredient that could help transform older baked forms into something closer to a sweet biscuit. The result would not have looked exactly like a modern cookie. These early sweet baked pieces were likely firmer, drier, and simpler. Some may have been enriched with nuts or perfumed with rosewater or spice. They may have been more delicate in flavor than rich. But the direction had changed. A small baked thing could now be made not only to last or to test an oven, but to please the senses. This is why Persia appears so often in the history of cookies. Not because a single baker there suddenly invented the dessert as we know it, but because a few important lines seem to meet there. Small baked forms already existed. Practical oven testing may already have encouraged tiny portions of dough. And now sugar entered the scene strongly enough to alter what those forms could become. It is useful to imagine the texture of that transition. The earlier sweet cookie-like foods were probably not soft in the middle, with melted chocolate and a buttery aroma filling the room. They were more restrained, more compact, more tied to the ingredients available at the time. Nuts may have played a larger role. Dates or figs may have shaped the sweetness in some cases. The dough may have baked into something closer to a crisp or firm bite than the tender cookies many people love now. And yet the basic idea is already there. A small portion, a shaped or dropped piece of dough. Sweetness worked into it, heat transforming the surface into something browned and fragrant. A baked food that can be held in the hand and eaten without cutting or serving utensils. That smallness is important. It gives the cookie its character from the beginning. Persian cooking also reminds us that sweetness was rarely alone. Even when sugar became more available, it often arrived among other sensory elements. Nuts added richness. Floral waters could add perfume. Spices could deepen the warmth of the bite. The cookie was not simply becoming sweet, it was becoming layered. That layering would matter later, as cookie traditions spread and changed in different regions. There is something quiet and elegant in that moment of change. A food that had once belonged more clearly to the world of utility begins to drift toward pleasure. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough that it can carry both meanings at the same time. It can still be practical. It can still be small and durable. But it can also begin to feel like something made with delight in mind. That is often how food history works. The grand changes are built from small adjustments. A little more sweetness, a little more access to certain ingredients, a little more confidence in heat and timing. Then, after enough generations, a new category seems to appear, even if no one at the time would have announced that anything entirely new had been born. So in Persia, the cookie story becomes clearer, not because it reaches its final form there, but because its outline sharpens. A small baked piece of dough, shaped by heat and made more appealing by sugar, begins to look less like survival food and more like a treat, even if still a modest one. The cookie is not fully here yet, but it is close enough to recognize in spirit. From there, that spirit does what so many food ideas do. It travels. It moves with ingredients, with trade, with cooks, with empires, with habits, and with taste itself. As sugar and spice travel westward, the small, sweet baked piece begins to find new homes, new names, and new forms. Once that sweeter form began to take shape, it did not stay in one place. Like many foods, it moved with people long before it moved through written recipes. The cookie's history is not only a kitchen story, it is also a story of roads, ports, caravans, and ships. As sugar spread outward from the Islamic world, so did new ways of baking with it. This did not happen all at once, and it did not happen neatly. Ingredients moved unevenly. Techniques changed as they traveled. Local tastes reshaped what arrived. But over time, the small, sweet baked piece that had begun to sharpen in places like Persia started finding new forms farther west. Part of this movement came through trade. Sugar, spices, nuts, and dried fruits were all goods that passed through long commercial networks. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg did not belong to every local landscape where they were eventually used. They arrived from elsewhere, often at great cost, and their rarity made them powerful. A small baked food, touched with those ingredients, could feel special even when it remained physically simple. The dough itself might be plain, but the scent could suggest distance, wealth, and the wider world. Part of the movement also came through conquest and cultural exchange. As Muslim rule extended into parts of the Iberian Peninsula, knowledge about sugar and sweet baking entered Europe more directly. Later, the Crusades helped expose more Europeans to ingredients and food traditions from the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. These moments are often simplified in food history, but the broader truth is clear enough. Europe did not invent sweet-spiced cookie traditions in isolation. It inherited, adapted, and transformed ideas that had already been developing elsewhere. That helps explain why so many early European cookie forms feel connected to both sweetness and spice. When these ingredients became more available in European cities, they did not simply get sprinkled over old habits. They changed what bakers imagined was possible. Honey cakes became more elaborate. Spice biscuits became more common in festive and religious settings. Small baked foods began to carry scents that earlier, blander travel breads never could. It is easy to picture how strong that change would have felt. Imagine entering a market where sacks of grain were ordinary, but the air around certain stalls held something else. Ginger, cinnamon, clove, orange peel, almond, a sharper sweetness, a deeper warmth. Even before tasting, people could smell that these baked things belonged to a different world than plain bread. Their ingredients told a story of distance, and yet these foods did not arrive as finished modern cookies. Each region adapted them according to its own climate, economy, and habits. A place with better access to butter would produce different textures than one relying more on oil, nuts, or honey. A city tied closely to trade might build richer traditions than a rural area where sugar remained scarce. In one place, a small sweet bake might become crisp and dry. In another, it might become dense and chewy. In one household, it might be saved for feast days. In another, it might be served with drink, not as dessert, but as part of hospitality. This is what makes the cookie so hard to pin down in its middle history. It keeps changing shape as it travels. It is not yet one fixed thing. It is a family of possibilities. Small, sweetened, baked foods, sometimes spiced, sometimes not, moving across languages and kitchens. Europe's later cookie traditions begin to grow from that soil. The spice-heavy baking associated with gingerbread and related forms would become especially important. So would wafer traditions, butter-rich biscuits, molded festival bakes, and hard twice-baked forms meant for storage or dunking. But before all of those become distinct, there is this quieter stage where ingredients are still arriving and bakers are still experimenting with how they belong together. That stage matters because it gives the cookie one of its lasting traits: adaptability. From the beginning, it was never just one thing carried intact from one place to another. It was reshaped wherever it landed. New ovens changed it. New grains changed it. New sweeteners changed it. New customs changed it. The cookie survived because it was small enough, flexible enough, and simple enough to be translated. So by the time sweet baked goods were becoming more familiar in Europe, the cookie was already a traveler. It had crossed borders before it crossed into modern language. And as it settled into more kitchens, another question began to matter. What exactly were these things being called? Because the closer we get to the cookie we recognize now, the more tangled the words around it begin to be. The closer we get to the modern cookie, the harder it becomes to draw a clean line around the word. Today, most people feel they know what a cookie is. The image arrives quickly. Something small, sweet, baked, and easy to hold. But older baked foods did not sit inside such tidy borders. A cookie, a biscuit, a wafer, and a small cake could overlap so much that the names often tell us less than we expect. Part of the difficulty is that cookie is a modern label placed over a much older and more varied family of baked things. When we look backward, we are often using today's language to describe foods that people at the time would have sorted differently, or perhaps not sorted very much at all. A hard twice-baked biscuit might be an ancestor of a cookie. A honey cake cut into small pieces might also belong to the story. A thin wafer, a spiced festival bake, a dry dunking biscuit, and a buttery little cake may all share family traits without being identical. This is why early cookies can seem to appear and disappear depending on how strictly the word is used. If we define a cookie very narrowly as a modern sweet dessert with a familiar texture, then many older examples seem too rough, too dry, too bread-like, or too cake-like to qualify. But if we think more gently, as food history often asks us to do, then the picture widens. Cookies begin to look less like a single invention and more like one branch of a much older tree. The word biscuit adds another layer of confusion. In North America, a biscuit usually means something entirely different from a cookie. It suggests a soft, savory, quick bread, pale inside and tender enough to split with the hands. In Britain and in many other places, biscuit often means what North Americans would simply call a cookie. A crisp chocolate digestive, a plain tea biscuit, a gingery snap. All of these fit comfortably inside the British use of biscuit. So even in the modern world, the language is split. The same baked thing can seem to change categories simply by crossing an ocean. Then there are wafers, which belong to the story, because they show another path small baked foods could take. Wafers are often thin, crisp, and light, sometimes closer to a sheet than a cake. They may feel more delicate than a cookie, but they share the same general idea of a small, handheld, finished baked piece. Some medieval and early modern baked goods sat somewhere between wafer and cookie, especially when sweetness, spice, or festive shaping entered the picture. Small cakes matter too. The old Dutch word that later gives us cookie meant little cake, and that older sense is important. Many early cookies would likely have looked more like tiny cakes than like the modern flat rounds people picture now. Others would have looked more like hard biscuits, baked until dry enough to store, stack, and carry. Texture, in other words, was not yet settled. A cookie could be crisp, dense, dry, crumbly, or only lightly sweet, and still belong to the broad family. That blurriness is not a problem. It is actually one of the most helpful things about this history. It reminds us that food categories are human habits, not laws of nature. People make what fits their ingredients, tools, and customs, and the names often come later. A baker did not need a perfect category to make something good. They needed flour, heat, fat, sweetness if they had it, and a reason to bake. So when we say cookie, we are gathering many older baked traditions into one familiar word. We are taking hard biscuits, little cakes, wafers, sweetened rounds, festival breads, and dry travel foods, and noticing where they begin to resemble one another. That resemblance matters more than the label itself. It lets us see continuity where the names might otherwise distract us. And once those names soften a little, the bigger question becomes easier to ask again. If cookies have worn so many forms and sat so close to biscuits, cakes, and wafers, then perhaps they have also played more than one role in human life. Perhaps they were not always what we would now call dessert. The question begins to answer itself once the older forms come into view. Cookies have not always been desserts, at least not in the modern sense of a sweet thing served after a meal simply for pleasure. For much of their history, cookie-like foods did other kinds of work. Some were made for travel. Hard, dry biscuits could last far longer than soft breads, which made them useful on roads, ships, and long journeys. A food like that was valued less for indulgence than for endurance. It could be stored, packed, and eaten when other food was not available. If it happened to contain a little sweetness, that did not necessarily make it dessert. It still belonged to the world of provision and practicality. Others were tied to ritual or ceremony. A small sweet baked thing could be offered at a feast, shaped for a holiday, or prepared at a certain time of year when ingredients and meaning came together. In that setting, the food was not merely a treat after dinner. It was part of a larger rhythm of observance, season, or hospitality. The baked form carried significance beyond taste. Some cookie-like foods also sat in a curious place between nourishment and remedy. Medieval people often thought about spices differently than most modern eaters do. Cinnamon, clove, ginger, and nutmeg were not only pleasant flavors, they were also believed to have effects on the body and spirit. This makes it easier to understand why a spice biscuit might be prepared as something helpful, warming, or balancing, rather than as a casual snack. One of the clearest examples comes from Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess whose writings touched medicine, theology, and the natural world. She became associated with spiced baked treats sometimes described as cookies of joy, made with ingredients like nutmeg, cinnamon, and clove. In that context, the cookie-like form was not just meant to please the tongue. It was meant to comfort, steady, and uplift. Even now, that idea feels a little surprising. A cookie as remedy, a sweetened spice bake as something prepared for the heart as much as for hunger. Monasteries help make sense of that world. They were important centers of organized baking, and they often had the resources, discipline, and ingredient access to preserve and refine recipes. In monastery kitchens, a small baked food could be denser, richer, and more intentional than an ordinary travel biscuit. Dried fruits, nuts, honey, and spice could all enter the picture. These foods were still not modern cookies, but they were becoming more layered, more fragrant, and more symbolic. They could be eaten slowly, paired with drink, or made for special moments rather than everyday hunger. That pairing with drink is another reminder that dessert is not the only role a cookie can play. Many early spice biscuits and similar baked goods were served with wine, ale, or later with tea and coffee. They might finish a meal, accompany conversation, or simply sit beside a cup. The modern idea of dessert, neat and separate, came later than many of these foods. Earlier tables were often less sharply divided. A small sweet biscuit could move through the day more freely. Even the texture supports this idea. A very hard biscuit meant for dipping behaves differently than a soft dessert cookie. It asks for time and company. It belongs with a mug, a cup, or a goblet. A dense honey spice bake meant for a feast belongs to a calendar and a season. A dry travel biscuit belongs to the road. These are all cookie-like foods, yet they do not live in the same category of use. The modern dessert cookie gathers many of these older threads into one familiar shape, but it smooths over their differences. Once sugar became more common, once baking grew more domestic in certain ways, and once pleasure became a more obvious purpose, the cookie moved closer to the form we recognize now. It became easier to think of it mainly as a sweet comfort. Yet the older roles did not disappear entirely. Even today, cookies are given as gifts, served with drinks, baked for holidays, and made to soothe people. The practical and symbolic history still lingers under the sweetness. What changes in the medieval world is not just that cookies become sweeter. They become more aromatic. Spice begins to define them in a deeper way, turning many small baked goods into fragrant markers of season, status, and celebration. Spice changed the identity of these baked foods in a way sweetness alone could not. Sugar made a small bake more pleasant, but spice gave it atmosphere. It filled the air before the first bite. It announced that something special was being made. In medieval and early modern Europe, spices such as cinnamon, ginger, clove, and nutmeg were not ordinary pantry items in the way they are now. They arrived through long trade routes, and their rarity gave them power. To flavor a baked food with them was to give it warmth, complexity, and also a kind of status. A plain biscuit could feed someone. A spiced one could suggest celebration, wealth, season, or care. This is part of why the history of cookies in Europe is so closely tied to spice baking. Once these ingredients began reaching more cities and kitchens, small baked foods became more expressive. Honey cakes grew more fragrant. Biscuits could carry deeper warmth. The bite itself changed, but so did the experience of being near the oven. The scent of ginger or cinnamon traveling through a room can make even a simple kitchen feel fuller, softer, and more ceremonial. Gingerbread is one of the clearest examples. In its older forms, it was not always the crisp, cut-out cookie people may picture today. It could be dense, chewy, dark with honey, and rich with spice. In some traditions, it sat somewhere between cookie and cake. In others, it was pressed into shapes or baked into firm slabs. Its importance comes not from one exact form, but from the way it shows what spice did to the whole family of cookie-like foods. It turned them into carriers of scent, season, and meaning. Nuremberg Lebkuchen stands out here for a reason. In that German city, positioned near important trade routes, bakers became known for making spiced honey cakes and biscuits that drew on ingredients from far beyond the local landscape. Almonds, citrus peel, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger could all meet inside a small bake. Some versions were dense and nutty, some glazed, some baked on thin wafers. They were rich not only in taste, but in association. They carried the presence of trade, winter, and festivity all at once. That kind of baking could only exist where ingredients were moving. A spice cookie is a map in edible form. Cinnamon may have traveled from South Asia or Sri Lanka. Cloves came from island regions far away. Nutmeg crossed oceans and commercial networks before it reached a European kitchen. Even when a cookie was small, the world inside it was large. And because those ingredients were precious, spiced cookies often became tied to occasions rather than daily life. A baker might reserve certain ingredients for feast days, religious celebrations, winter gatherings, or gifts. The result was that spice entered memory very early. Certain scents became connected with particular times of year, with waiting, with family, with markets, with candlelight, with cold air outside and warm ovens within. This may be one reason cookies became such powerful memory foods later on. Their emotional role was already forming in the age of spice. It is easy to imagine the contrast. A dry travel biscuit has its own dignity, but it does not perfume a room. A spiced honey bake does. The oven door opens and suddenly the space changes. Warmth takes on a scent. Cinnamon softens the air. Ginger sharpens it. Clove deepens it. Nutmeg rounds it out. Long before anyone talks about nostalgia or comfort food, the senses already know that something memorable is happening. Spice also changed how these foods were seen socially. A spiced biscuit could suggest refinement, generosity, or devotion. It could be shaped with care, given in hospitality, or prepared for a season that mattered. Even a small quantity of spice was enough to transform the feeling of the bake. This helps explain why molded biscuits, glazed festive cookies, and rich gingerbreads became such lasting parts of European food tradition. They were never only about hunger. By this point, the cookie is becoming more recognizable, not because it has settled into one perfect modern form, but because it is gaining the qualities people still respond to now. Warmth, fragrance, sweetness balanced by depth. The sense that a small baked thing can carry far more feeling than its size would suggest. And yet these foods were not living only in wealthy kitchens or festive halls. As they spread, they also began to appear in places much closer to everyday life, on household tables, in public markets, and in the seasonal rhythms of ordinary people. As these baked foods moved outward from monasteries, trade centers, and wealthier kitchens, they became easier to encounter in ordinary life. Their ingredients were still unevenly distributed, and many remained special in one way or another. But cookies and cookie-like foods were no longer confined to rare or distant settings. They began to appear in homes, in market stalls, and in the repeating celebrations that helped shape the year. This is one of the reasons cookies settled so naturally into daily culture. They were small. They could be made in batches. They could be stored more easily than soft cakes. They could be stacked, wrapped, carried, shared, and offered without much ceremony. A large cake often belongs to a single moment. A tray of smaller baked things can belong to many moments at once. In the home, that flexibility mattered. A household with flour, some sweetener, and enough heat could produce something modest but satisfying. Not every home had access to costly spices or abundant sugar. Of course, but even simpler forms could still fit the same pattern. Dough could be rolled, cut, pressed, or shaped by hand. A bake could be made for visitors, for children, for a holiday, or simply because the oven was already warm and ingredients needed using. The smallness of the cookie made it practical for ordinary kitchens. Markets gave these foods another kind of life. A market stall does not need a grand dessert that must be sliced and served carefully. It benefits from something visible, fragrant, portable, and easy to buy in small amounts. Cookies were well suited to that world. A passerby could pause, choose one or several, and carry them away. A table could be lined with spiced rounds, crisp wafers, honeyed cakes, or molded festival bakes, each one distinct enough to catch the eye and simple enough to sell. There is something easy to picture here. Wooden stalls in cold air, baskets and trays laid out in rows, brown loaves at one table, brighter glazed baked goods at another. The scent of cinnamon and toasted flour drifting outward as people move past. Cloths folded under still warm trays. Hands reaching, pointing, paying, wrapping. Cookies did not need much introduction in such places. Their appeal could rise from the table on its own. Festivals and holidays help deepen that appeal. Small baked foods are especially good at becoming seasonal traditions because they are shareable and repeatable. They can be made ahead. They can travel to relatives or neighbors. They can be shaped for a feast day, a winter gathering, or a public celebration. Their size invites abundance. Instead of one object in the center of the table, there can be many. A pile suggests generosity. A tin or tray suggests continuity. The same shapes and scents return each year, and with them comes memory. Winter traditions are especially important here. In colder months, when people gathered indoors more often and stored foods had greater value, cookies fit naturally into the season. They could last. They could be made in quantity. They paired well with warm drinks and long evenings. Their spices also match the feeling of winter festivities. Cinnamon, ginger, clove, and nutmeg do not simply flavor a cookie. They help create a season around it. That does not mean cookies suddenly became common everywhere in exactly the same way. Access still depended on region, class, ingredients, and local habits. But the direction is clear. A food that may once have felt more medicinal, ceremonial, or elite was becoming more familiar. It was moving closer to ordinary people, not by losing all meaning, but by gaining new uses. It could still be festive, but it could also be domestic. It could still be special, but it no longer had to be rare. This shift matters because it helps explain why cookies became such strong social foods. They did not remain locked inside one purpose. They could be sold in public, baked in private, carried to gatherings, stored for later, and shaped by the calendar. They fit markets because they were easy to buy. They fit homes because they were easy to make in small or large amounts. They fit festivals because they were easy to share. By now, the cookie is no longer only a traveling idea, passing from region to region through trade and spice. It is becoming a settled part of life, appearing in kitchens and public spaces, often enough that people begin to attach it to place, language, and habit. And from all the many local words surrounding these baked foods, one particular word will become especially important once the story crosses into North America. At some point in the story, the familiar word finally appears. Not the food itself, which had already been evolving for centuries, but the name many people use today. The word cookie has a quieter history than the baked goods it describes, but it helps anchor the modern idea in language. Cookie comes from the Dutch word koekje, which simply means little cake. The word koek means cake, and the small ending j turns it into something smaller and more modest. A koekje was not imagined as a crisp round dessert, the way many people picture a cookie today. It was simply a small cake, a bite-sized baked thing that belonged to the broader world of cakes and sweet bakes. That older meaning explains something interesting about early cookie history. Many baked foods we would now call cookies were once understood as small members of the cake family. They shared ingredients, techniques, and even sections in early recipe collections. The difference between cake and cookie was not yet as sharp as it is today. The word itself traveled into English through Dutch settlement in North America. In the 17th century, Dutch settlers established communities in the region that became New Netherland, including the city known today as New York, which was originally called New Amsterdam. Along with language, architecture, and food habits, they brought words that described everyday life. Koekje was one of them. Over time, English speakers in the region adapted the pronunciation into cookie. The sound softened, the spelling shifted, and the word began settling into English usage. What matters most here is that the name did not invent the food. The baked traditions were already present in Europe in many forms. The word simply attached itself to part of that tradition in North America and stayed there. This is why the history of the word and the history of the food are not identical. Cookie is a linguistic arrival rather than the beginning of the baked thing itself. Long before the word became common, people were already making small sweet biscuits, honey cakes, spiced festival bakes, and many other forms that belong to the cookie's broader family. Even after the word appeared, the older understanding lingered for quite some time. Early American cookbooks often grouped cookies within cake sections, rather than treating them as a completely separate category. Recipes for little cakes, tea cakes, and other small bakes might appear alongside what modern readers would recognize as cookies. The family resemblance was still obvious to the people writing and using those recipes. It also helps explain why some early cookies had textures that feel closer to cake than to the crisp or chewy forms people expect today. A small cake baked in individual portions is not far from what a cookie once meant. Only later would the modern image settle into place. Flatter shapes, distinct textures, and a clearer separation between cookies, cakes, and biscuits. Language tends to follow practice rather than lead it. People bake something, share it, repeat it, and only afterward do the words stabilize around the habit. Cookie is one of those words that gradually found its footing because it matched a common experience. A small, sweet baked thing was becoming a familiar presence, especially in North America, and a simple word helped identify it. At the same time, the word did not erase the many traditions already alive across Europe. Dutch koekjes were only one thread among many. In other regions, bakers continued making their own small biscuits, spice cakes, wafer-like bakes, and festival cookies, each with its own name and character. The English word cookie would grow in importance in North America, but the broader world of cookie traditions remained wonderfully diverse. That diversity becomes easier to see when the story widens again. Once the name cookie settles into place in the New World, the baked traditions feeding into it stretch outward across Europe, where many distinct forms had already been developing for generations. Across Europe, the cookie developed less like a single invention and more like a gathering of local habits. By the time the word cookie began settling into North American English, Europe already held a wide range of small baked traditions, each shaped by its own climate, ingredients, religion, trade links, and tastes. Some were dry enough to keep for weeks. Some were rich with butter. Some leaned on nuts rather than flour. Some were strongly spiced. Some were made for feast days, and others for daily cups of tea or coffee. Shortbread offers one gentle example. In Scotland, what later became shortbread seems to have grown from something once called biscuit bread, a harder baked form connected to leftover bread dough that was dried in the oven. Over time, that older practicality softened into something richer. Butter took a stronger role. The texture became more delicate and crumbly. The finished bake could be cut into rounds, fingers, or wedges, pale and sandy, with a clean, buttery taste that feels almost quiet compared with more heavily spiced cookies. Shortbread shows how an older biscuit tradition could gradually become more tender, more refined, and more recognizably close to a modern cookie. In the Low Countries, speculoos and related spice biscuits took another path. These were often shaped in carved molds and flavored with spice mixtures that could include cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, ginger, and pepper. They carried a sharper fragrance and a more decorative spirit than something like shortbread. A molded biscuit does not only offer flavor, it offers image and form. Saints, windmills, animals, and other figures could be pressed into dough, turning a simple bake into something visual and seasonal. Here the cookie becomes not only something to eat, but something to look at before the first bite. Italy gives us biscotti, which belong to the older twice-baked family. They are dry by design, meant to last and to be dipped. That dryness is not a flaw. It is the point. The first bake creates the loaf, and the second firms the slices into something crisp and durable. Almonds often play an important role, adding richness without making the cookie soft. Biscotti remind us that the cookie's history does not move only toward tenderness. Some of its most enduring forms keep the older values of storage, portability, and pairing with drink. France adds a different mood. Early macarons, long before the colorful sandwich form many people know today, were small almond-based cookies with a lighter, more delicate feel. Their texture and ingredients place them on another branch of the family tree, one where nuts, sweetness, and elegance come forward in a new way. They are still small, still baked, still held in the hand, but they show how far the cookie can stretch from the dry biscuit and still remain part of the same broad world. Wafers continue that stretching even further. Thin, crisp, sometimes almost weightless, they occupy the edge of what people might call a cookie. Yet they belong in this story because they show how varied small, sweet baked foods could be. Some were made for layering, some for church use, some for festive tables, some for simple enjoyment. Their lightness contrasts with denser bakes like gingerbread or shortbread. But the contrast itself is part of the point. And then there is gingerbread, perhaps one of the most important European bridges between older spiced honey cakes and later cookies. In some places, it stayed soft and dense. In others, it became firmer and more decorative. In all its forms, it carried the warmth of trade and the memory of seasons. Spice, honey, nuts, and careful shaping made it one of the clearest examples of how a cookie-like food could be practical, ceremonial, sensory, and social at the same time. Taken together, these traditions reveal that Europe did not hand North America one single cookie model. It offered a whole collection of possibilities, crisp and dry, buttery and crumbly, nut-based and chewy, molded and festive, glazed, dipped, spiced, or plain. Each one shows a different solution to the same broad idea: a small baked food, finished and self-contained, shaped by local life. That variety matters because it explains why cookies adapted so easily once they crossed the Atlantic. The form was already flexible. It had already learned how to change from place to place. What happened in North America was not the start of cookie history, but another transformation inside a very old and very varied tradition. When European cookie traditions crossed into North America, they did not arrive unchanged. They entered a different landscape of ingredients, weather, ovens, and habits, and they had to adapt. That adaptation gave North American cookies much of their character. The old forms remained in memory, but the dough itself began to change. One of the clearest changes involved sweetness. Refined sugar was not always the easiest ingredient to obtain in early North American kitchens, especially in ordinary households. Molasses often became a more practical option. Dark, thick, and deeply flavored, it brought sweetness in a different form. It did not simply replace sugar without consequence. It changed the taste, color, and feel of the baked goods it entered. A cookie sweetened with molasses carries a darker warmth. It browns differently. It feels heavier, earthier, and often more suited to ginger and spice than to delicate lightness. This helps explain why sturdy, strongly flavored cookies became such a natural fit in early North America. Ginger snaps, molasses cookies, simple butter cookies, and other firm household bakes made sense in a setting where food still needed to be practical. These were not always extravagant desserts made for display. Many were durable, sensible, and comforting. They could hold up in storage tins. They could travel a bit. They could be made with ingredients a household already knew how to keep on hand. The kitchen itself shaped them too. Home ovens in colonial and early post-colonial North America were not the same as modern ovens with stable temperatures and reliable controls. Baking still depended heavily on judgment. A baker watched heat through experience rather than through a dial. That encouraged recipes that could tolerate some variation and rewarded doughs that were forgiving enough to survive uneven baking. Simpler cookies had an advantage in that kind of environment. They asked less of the oven than a large cake and less of the cook than a delicate pastry. Local grain mattered as well. Wheat in North America did not always behave exactly like the wheat used in European kitchens, and flour quality could vary from region to region. That meant dough had to be understood through touch, as much as through written instruction. A baker learned when it felt too loose, too dry, too sticky, or just right. This kind of knowledge kept cookie baking tied to the hand and the home, even as recipes slowly circulated more widely. Immigrant traditions also continued shaping the cookie landscape. Dutch, English, Scottish, German, and other European baking habits mixed together, sometimes clearly and sometimes quietly. A family might keep a spice biscuit from one old country, a butter-rich bake from another, and a new molasses habit learned after arrival. North American cookie history is not the story of one tradition replacing another. It is more like a kitchen shelf where several traditions sit beside each other and gradually influence one another. That mixture is part of what makes North American cookies feel so domestic. They are less like a single inherited form and more like a set of household solutions. What sweetener is affordable? What flour is available? What kind of bake keeps well? What recipe is easy to repeat? What fits the season? What children will like? What can be served to guests without fuss? Cookies answer all of those questions with unusual ease. Pleasure, of course, was always part of the picture too. A butter cookie is not only practical. A ginger snap is not only durable. These foods were enjoyed because they tasted good, smelled good, and added warmth to the day. But in North America, the cookie seems to hold on to practicality for longer than people sometimes notice. It stays close to the rhythm of household life. It is baked in the same place where bread is baked, where meals are prepared, where ingredients are stretched and reused carefully. That closeness to daily life matters. It keeps the cookie grounded. Even when it becomes sweeter, softer, and more varied, it still feels like something that belongs on a kitchen counter rather than behind glass. It remains tied to ordinary labor and ordinary comfort. A hand-mixed dough, a warm tray, a tin that opens and closes over several days. By this point, the history is well enough established that the cookie can begin to be examined more closely, not just as a cultural object, but as a physical one. Because once flour, sweetness, and fat gather in the bowl, something very specific begins to happen. The cookie's history explains why it exists, but its texture depends on quieter forces inside the dough itself. Now the story becomes smaller and closer to the bowl. After all the travel, trade, language, and tradition, a cookie still depends on a few ordinary ingredients meeting each other in the right way. Flour, sugar, and butter may seem simple on a counter, but once they are mixed together, each begins doing a very different kind of work. Flour gives the cookie its body. Without it, there is no real structure to hold anything in place. Flour absorbs moisture, thickens the dough, and helps the cookie keep some kind of form as it bakes. It is also where gluten begins, though gluten does not need to be described in heavy terms to be understood. It is enough to picture flour as the part that helps the dough hold together, instead of melting into a puddle. More flour usually means a firmer, thicker dough. Less flour usually means more spread, more softness, or more fragility. A cookie that snaps cleanly, bends gently, or crumbles into sand-like bits is often revealing something about how much flour it contains and how the flour has behaved. Butter, or another fat in its place, does something almost opposite. Where flour builds structure, butter relaxes it. It softens the dough, coats the flour and helps create tenderness. It also brings richness and aroma. Even before baking, butter changes the feeling of the mixture under a spoon or hand. It makes the dough smoother, more pliable, and more luxurious. Once heat enters the picture, butter melts and moves, helping the cookie spread outward and giving it that familiar sense of softness or delicacy. A cookie without enough fat can feel dry or overly firm. A cookie with more fat often feels richer, shorter, or more fragile at the bite. Butter also influences flavor in a way flour cannot. Flour is quiet. Butter is not. It carries creaminess, warmth, and that unmistakable smell that rises when a tray first leaves the oven. That is one reason cookies feel different from many other sweet baked goods. Their richness is often immediate. The butter is not hidden. It is part of the first scent and part of the last softness left on the tongue. Then there is sugar, which does much more than make a cookie sweet. Sugar affects browning, moisture, and texture. It helps create the golden edges that make a cookie look finished and inviting. It changes how the dough spreads. It influences whether the final texture feels crisp, tender, or moist. In a way, sugar helps determine whether a cookie feels lively and delicate or dense and calm. White sugar and brown sugar show this difference clearly. White sugar tends to produce a cleaner sweetness and often a crisper result. Brown sugar carries molasses within it, which adds moisture and depth. A dough made with more brown sugar often feels softer and darker, with a texture that stays gentler after baking. A cookie made with more white sugar may bake into something lighter in flavor, but firmer at the edge, with more snap and a more obvious sugar crust. Neither is better. They simply guide the cookie in different directions. And this is where the ordinary magic of cookies begins to show. The ingredients do not just sit beside each other, they negotiate. Flour tries to hold shape. Butter tries to soften and loosen. Sugar sweetens, but also pulls moisture and encourages browning. Even before eggs or leavening appear, these three are already shaping the future of the cookie. A tiny change in balance can produce a very different result. More flour, and the cookie may stay thicker and feel drier. More butter, and it may spread more and melt into a softer bite. More brown sugar, and it may hold moisture and chew. More white sugar, and it may crisp and crackle more at the surface. That is why two cookies made from nearly the same ingredients can still feel like very different foods once they come out of the oven. It is also why cookies are so personal. What one person calls perfect may be a crisp edge and a dry snap. Another may want softness in the center and a deeper, darker sweetness. The cookie allows for both because the ingredients are so responsive. They can be nudged one way or another with very small decisions. So even before baking begins, the cookie is already taking shape in a quiet conversation between structure, richness, and sweetness. And after those three larger forces settle into place, one smaller ingredient enters and changes the texture more than its size would suggest. The egg arrives almost quietly, but it changes nearly everything. Eggs do not usually get the same attention as flour, sugar, or butter, but they quietly shape much of what a cookie becomes. They sit in the bowl without much drama, yet once they are mixed into the dough, they begin affecting moisture, structure, richness, and texture all at once. The simplest way to understand an egg in a cookie is to think of it as both liquid and framework. It adds moisture, which helps the dough come together and keeps the finished cookie from feeling too dry. But it also adds proteins, and those proteins firm up as they bake. So the egg does two things at once. It softens the dough while it is raw, and then it helps set the cookie once heat reaches it. That balance is part of what makes eggs so useful. Without egg, many cookies become noticeably more fragile. The dough may feel drier, more crumbly, and less willing to hold together. During baking, the cookie may spread less or break more easily after it cools. Some cookies do fine without eggs, especially those meant to be sandy or delicate. But in many recipes, the absence is obvious. The finished bake can feel flatter in more than one sense, not just physically, but texturally too. It may crumble quickly in the mouth instead of holding a softer or chewier shape. Part of this comes from the different jobs done by the two main parts of the egg. The white is mostly water and protein. It helps with structure and brings a cleaner kind of firmness. The yolk is richer, carrying fat and emulsifiers that make the dough smoother and more luxurious. If the white tends to help a cookie hold itself up, the yolk tends to help it feel more tender and full. Neither works alone in quite the same way as the whole egg. Together, they create a balance between lift, moisture, and richness. It is easy to picture this if you think of the moment the egg enters the bowl. The shell cracks, the clear white and golden yolk slip into the mixture, and the dough changes almost immediately. What was once more separate begins to bind. Butter, sugar, and flour no longer feel like loose parts trying to coexist. The egg helps knit them together. It gives the dough gloss. It gives it flexibility. It smooths roughness. That smoothing matters because cookies are such a careful balance of forces. Flour wants to build structure. Butter wants to soften it. Sugar changes texture and browning. The egg helps these competing influences stay in conversation. It gives the dough enough unity to survive mixing, shaping, and baking without losing all tenderness. The white and the yolk can also shift texture in different directions when emphasized. More egg white can help a cookie feel firmer or a bit chewier because of the added protein and water. More yolk can push it toward richness, softness, and a more delicate crumb. This is part of why some cookies feel almost cakey, while others remain flatter and denser. The egg is not the only reason, but it is one of them. There is also something visually gentle about the egg's effect. Dough with enough egg often looks smoother and more finished before it even enters the oven. It may scoop more cleanly. It may hold a rounded shape with less cracking. After baking, that same dough may produce a cookie with a more even surface, a softer center, or a more complete sense of cohesion. Nothing about the change is loud. It is all quiet support. This quietness suits the cookie well. Eggs do not usually define a cookie's identity the way ginger or chocolate might. They work behind the scenes. Most people do not bite into a cookie and say they taste the egg first. What they notice instead is the result. The chew, the softness, the way the cookie holds together just long enough before breaking apart. So while flour gives structure, butter gives richness, and sugar gives sweetness and browning, the egg helps the whole mixture behave like one thing instead of many separate ones. It brings moisture, binding, and balance in a way that is easy to miss until it is gone. And once the dough is holding together, another transformation begins. Air, heat, and leavening start to act on it, and the still surface of the dough turns into something lifted, cracked, spread, or softly rounded in the oven. Once the dough is mixed, it can still look quiet and unfinished, almost as if nothing important has happened yet. A mound of cookie dough sitting on a tray does not reveal very much, but the moment it enters the oven, the stillness begins to break. Heat wakes everything up. One of the first things to understand is that a cookie does not simply bake. It moves. It spreads, lifts, firms, cracks, and settles, all within a short span of time. What looks simple from outside is actually a small chain of changes happening all at once. Fat begins to melt. Moisture begins to turn into steam. Tiny pockets of trapped air expand. Sugars start dissolving and shifting. Proteins begin to firm. The dough becomes less like a paste and more like a finished shape. Leavening helps guide part of this movement. In many cookies, that means baking soda or baking powder. These ingredients work quietly, but they matter. They release gas during mixing or baking, which creates tiny bubbles inside the dough. Those bubbles help the cookie lift a little, soften its interior, or spread in a particular way. A cookie usually does not rise dramatically like a loaf of bread, but even a slight puff or gentle crack across the surface can be the sign of leavening doing its work. Baking soda and baking powder are similar, though not quite the same. Baking soda needs acid in the dough to react well. Baking powder carries more of that reaction within itself. In either case, the goal is not to turn a cookie into something airy and lofty. It is to influence texture and shape. Too little leavening, and a cookie may feel dense or flat. Too much, and it may puff too far, collapse oddly, or take on a more cakey texture than intended. But chemical leavening is only part of the story. Air can be built into the dough even before it reaches the oven. This is one reason recipes so often begin by creaming butter and sugar together. When butter and sugar are beaten, the sugar crystals cut through the fat and help trap tiny pockets of air. These pockets are small, but once heat reaches them, they expand. That gives the cookie a head start. The dough enters the oven already holding little spaces that can open further. It helps to picture the cookie on the tray in stages. At first, the dough softens as the butter melts. If the dough is rich or warm, it may begin to relax outward quickly. Then the trapped air and gases start to push gently from inside. Moisture turns to steam and adds to that movement. The edges begin setting first because they are thinner and more exposed. The center lags behind, staying softer for longer. This is why a cookie can spread at the edges while still puffing slightly in the middle. Oven temperature changes this balance more than many people realize. A hotter oven can set the outside faster, sometimes keeping a cookie thicker because the edges firm before the whole piece has time to spread too far. In other cases, strong heat can encourage rapid expansion and deeper cracking. A gentler oven may allow more gradual spreading before the dough fully sets. The same dough can therefore look quite different depending on the heat around it. This is why cookies can emerge from the oven with such varied shapes. Some stay thick and rounded. Some flatten into broad circles. Some crack across the top in a dry, beautiful pattern. Some stay smooth and pale. Some rise just enough to feel soft in the center, while the edges turn golden and firm. Even before texture is discussed directly, shape is already telling part of the story. There is also a quiet drama in the timing. A cookie is always balancing movement and setting. It wants to spread, but not too far. It wants to lift, but not too much. It wants to firm enough to hold together, but not so quickly that it loses tenderness. The finished shape is really the record of that short negotiation. So by the time a tray leaves the oven, the cookie has already lived through a small transformation of motion, gas, steam, and structure. What began as a scoop or cut piece of dough has become something with edges, height, surface, and form. And once that form is there, the next difference becomes the one people notice most easily with the mouth and the hand. A cookie can snap, bend, crumble, or drag softly at the center, and each of those textures begins in the choices that shaped it. Texture is where the cookie becomes personal. History explains where it came from, and ingredients explain how it forms. But texture is often the part people love most immediately. A cookie can feel right or wrong before anyone even finishes the first bite. It may snap cleanly. It may bend at the edge and give way softly in the center. It may crumble into fine sandy pieces or cling for a moment with a deep chew. All of these are cookies, yet they feel almost like different species. A crisp cookie usually comes from a certain kind of dryness and structure. Less moisture, more thorough baking, and often a greater role for white sugar can push a cookie in that direction. White sugar tends to help create a cleaner snap and a more brittle edge. A thinner dough or a cookie that spreads more widely in the oven may also end up crisper because there is less soft interior left behind. When you break one apart, it may sound sharp and light. The crumbs scatter quickly. The bite is immediate. A soft cookie moves another way. It holds more moisture and resists that full snap. The edge may still offer a little firmness, but the center stays tender, almost relaxed. Brown sugar often helps here because of the molasses it carries. That extra moisture can keep the cookie softer for longer, both in the oven and afterward. Slightly shorter baking can do the same. A soft cookie often feels warmer somehow, even when cool, because it gives under the bite rather than resisting it. Chewiness sits in its own place between softness and structure. A chewy cookie does not crumble away quickly, but it does not feel cakey either. It stretches a little. It asks the teeth to stay with it for a moment. Brown sugar can help create that quality, and so can melted butter in some recipes. Underbaking slightly can preserve that center too, leaving just enough moisture for the cookie to resist in a pleasant way. Oatmeal cookies often lean in this direction. So do many chocolate chip cookies people describe as ideal. Crumbly cookies offer a different pleasure. They break apart more easily and often feel shorter, drier, and more delicate. Shortbread is a good example. The bite does not stretch or cling. It gives way almost at once, dissolving into fine fragments. This usually comes from a balance that favors fat and flour, without too much moisture or binding. The result can feel gentle and quiet, almost powdery in the mouth, especially when butter is doing much of the flavoring. These textures are shaped by several forces working together. Moisture is one of the biggest. More moisture usually means more softness or chew, while less moisture pushes toward crispness or crumble. Sugar type matters too. Brown sugar tends to hold moisture more easily than white sugar, which is one reason it often produces a softer or chewier cookie. Fat treatment matters as well. Melted butter can encourage spread and tenderness, while creamed butter can create more lift and structure through trapped air. Bake time may be the final deciding voice. A minute or two longer can pull a soft center toward crispness. A minute or two shorter can preserve a tender middle that would otherwise set more firmly. Then there is browning, which adds another layer to texture by shaping flavor. As a cookie browns, sugars and proteins react with heat and begin creating deeper notes. This is part of what makes the edges taste fuller and more complex than the raw dough ever could. The deeper the browning, the more the cookie may suggest toast, caramel, nuts, or even a slight bitterness that balances sweetness. A pale cookie can still be good, but a golden one often feels more complete. Color and texture tend to deepen each other. What people call the perfect cookie depends partly on what they want this texture to be. Some want a dry snap with tea. Some want a rich center that almost feels underbaked. Some want the edge crisp and the middle soft enough to fold. Some want a crumb that breaks cleanly and vanishes almost at once. The cookie invites these preferences because it is so responsive. Small changes in dough become obvious in the hand and the mouth. This may be part of why cookies feel so intimate. A loaf of bread can vary too, but a cookie makes its texture known immediately. The fingers feel it first, then the sound, then the bite. The whole experience is quick but detailed. Snap, bend, crumble, drag, warmth. The cookie speaks through texture almost as much as through flavor. And once texture enters the body like that, the story widens again. The cookie is no longer only a baked object on a tray. It becomes part of memory, comfort, and the strange ease with which certain smells and textures can make a person feel briefly at home. This may be the point where the cookie feels most familiar. After all the centuries of trade, ovens, sugar, and changing ingredients, it arrives in the present not only as food, but as comfort. A cookie can feel reassuring in a way that is hard to explain fully until you notice how many quiet memories seem to gather around it. Part of that comfort begins with smell. Long before a cookie is tasted, it is often sensed through the air. Butter warming in the oven, sugar beginning to brown, vanilla opening, cinnamon lifting upward from the tray. These smells travel quickly and settle deeply. They do not ask for much attention, yet they can change the feeling of a room almost at once. A kitchen with cookies in the oven often feels softer than it did a few minutes earlier, even before anyone takes the first bite. Scent is powerful, partly because it reaches memory so directly. Many people do not simply smell a cookie and think of ingredients. They think of a place, a counter at home, a parent or grandparent baking late in the day, a holiday table, a school lunch, a winter afternoon, a tray cooling while voices move in the background. The smell does not always bring back one clear scene. Sometimes it brings back a whole atmosphere, a feeling of safety or being cared for that arrives before words do. That may be one reason cookies became such lasting symbols of home life. They are small enough to be casual, but special enough to feel intentional. A large cake can mark an event. A cookie can mark ordinary kindness. Someone can bake a dozen cookies not to make an announcement, but simply to fill the house with warmth, to leave something on a plate, to offer a small pleasure at the end of a day. Their size helps. A cookie feels personal. It can be given one at a time. This smallness also makes cookies feel approachable. They do not demand ceremony. They can sit in a tin, on a napkin, beside a cup, in a lunchbox, on the edge of a plate. Because of that, they slip easily into moments of care. An after-school snack, a plate brought to a neighbor, a batch left for guests, a few cookies packed for a trip, a quiet offering to someone who is tired, lonely, recovering, or simply visiting. The gesture is modest, but it carries weight precisely because it is modest. Warmth matters too. Many of the foods people describe as comforting share some form of warmth, either literal or remembered. A cookie fresh from the oven still holds heat in the center. Even when it has cooled, it often carries the memory of warmth more strongly than many other sweets. This may come from the ingredients themselves. Butter, spice, toasted sugar, vanilla, and baked flour all suggest warmth in different ways. Together, they create a sense of softness that lingers beyond temperature. There is also the matter of repetition. Cookies often return in the same forms across years. The same gingerbread in winter. The same butter cookies at family gatherings. The same chocolate chip recipe made without measuring too carefully, because the hands already know it. Repetition builds trust. When a smell and texture return again and again in similar settings, they begin to feel dependable. The cookie becomes not only pleasant, but familiar in a deeper way. It reminds the body that some things repeat kindly. Children often meet this feeling early. A cookie is easy to hold, easy to portion, and easy to associate with reward. But even in adulthood, that early link can remain. A cookie can still suggest praise, rest, celebration, or welcome. Not because it is luxurious, but because it is manageable. It is a sweetness scaled to ordinary life. This may explain why cookies have remained so emotionally durable even as their forms change. A cookie can be crisp or soft, plain or elaborate, homemade or bought, and still preserve its role as a signal of care. The shape can change. The ingredients can change. The social meaning stays surprisingly steady. And once that private comfort becomes strong enough, the cookie naturally begins to move outward into shared life. What comforts one person in a kitchen can also comfort a group around a table. What begins as memory and care inside the home soon becomes hospitality, ritual, and social exchange in the wider world. By this point in the story, the cookie begins to look very familiar again. After all the older histories of honey cakes, hard biscuits, spice roots, and small domestic bakes, we arrive at the forms many people now know almost without thinking. The cookie becomes something recognized at a glance. A chocolate chip cookie with a soft center and browned edge. A crisp sandwich cookie split by a sweet layer. A peanut butter cookie marked with fork lines. A sugar cookie rolled, cut, and decorated. An oatmeal cookie that feels hearty even when sweet. a round of shortbread that crumbles almost before it is fully chewed. These cookies feel modern, but most of them carry older ideas inside them. Shortbread, for example, is old in spirit, even when it appears in neat modern rounds or packaged tins. It still depends on that older love of butter, flour, and crumbly texture. Sugar cookies also feel both old and new at once. The basic idea of a small sweet dough shaped and baked is ancient, but the brightly decorated holiday version many people picture today belongs to a more recent domestic tradition. The same is true of oatmeal cookies. Oats and simple household baking have long histories, yet the cookie form people now recognize belongs to a later, more settled recipe culture. Chocolate chip cookies are perhaps the clearest example of a modern classic. Their story is often connected to Ruth Wakefield, who in 1938, at the Toll House Inn in Massachusetts, added pieces of chocolate to cookie dough and helped create the version that would become famous across the United States and far beyond. Whether people tell the story as an accident or as a simple experiment, the result is what matters. The chocolate chip cookie gathered several older comforts into one form: butter, sweetness, warmth, browning, and the contrast between dough and chocolate. It feels almost inevitable now, but it is relatively young compared with many other cookie traditions. There is something fitting about that. The chocolate chip cookie does not look ancient. It looks like a cookie already living in a modern kitchen, in a world of printed recipes, branded chocolate, and home baking tied to family life. Yet even it depends on older foundations. It still uses the same broad language of flour, fat, sugar, and smallness. It still carries the domestic warmth that made cookies beloved long before chocolate chips appeared. Sandwich cookies belong to another modern path. Instead of emphasizing the baked dough alone, they add a filling and turn the cookie into a kind of paired structure. Two crisp pieces with sweetness in the middle create a texture that is different from the softer homemade cookie on a tray. The experience becomes more deliberate. There is a snap, then a smooth center, then another snap. Industrial baking played an important role in making this kind of cookie widely familiar, because consistency matters when two sides have to match. A sandwich cookie is not only baked, it is assembled. Peanut butter cookies add yet another recognizable note. Their flavor is deeper, toastier, and more grounded than many other sweet cookies. The fork marks pressed into the dough before baking have become part of their visual identity, making them easy to picture even without a plate in front of you. Oatmeal cookies move differently too. They often feel more textured and substantial, with a chew that comes not only from sugar and butter, but from the oats themselves. They sit close to the old idea that a cookie can be both pleasant and practical, both comforting and filling. What ties all these forms together is not one exact recipe, but a shared role in modern life. They are the cookies people know best because they have become repeatable, recognizable, and widely shared. A person can picture them without needing explanation. Their shapes, textures, and names have settled into culture. And yet, even here, the old story remains visible. Some famous cookies are old in spirit, but modern in their current form. Some are clearly products of the 20th century, but built from much older baking logic. None of them appeared from nowhere. they are all endings and beginnings at once. Because once a cookie becomes famous enough, it rarely stays private. It leaves the mixing bowl and the family tin. It turns up at school events, holidays, church halls, office tables, coffee breaks, wrapped gifts, and gatherings where people pass food by hand. The cookie becomes not only recognizable, but shared. Once cookies became familiar enough to recognize at a glance, they also became one of the easiest foods to share. This may be one of the simplest reasons they took such a strong place in social life. A cookie is small, finished, and easy to carry. It does not need slicing, plating, or much explanation. It can be wrapped in paper, stacked in a tin, set beside a cup, or passed from one hand to another without interrupting the moment around it. That makes cookies unusually good at living in both ordinary and meaningful settings. They can belong to a rushed weekday afternoon or to a holiday that returns only once a year. They can sit in a lunchbox beside fruit and a sandwich, or rest on a decorated tray at the center of a family gathering. Few foods move so easily between routine and ritual. In everyday life, cookies often appear in the quiet spaces between larger events. An after-school snack, a plate left on the counter, a few biscuits offered with tea or coffee when someone stops by. A small sweet thing with enough substance to feel comforting, but not so much that it becomes a full occasion of its own. This is part of their social usefulness. They fill little gaps in the day. They help people pause together. Tea and coffee rituals gave cookies a natural place to settle. A hot drink asks for a companion, and cookies answer that request well. A crisp biscuit can be dipped. A soft cookie can be eaten slowly beside a mug while conversation drifts. In this setting, the cookie is not just sweet. It becomes part of rhythm. Sip, bite, pause, speak, listen. That rhythm can make even a simple kitchen table feel gently ceremonial. Then there are holidays and seasonal gatherings where cookies seem to multiply almost on their own. Because they can be made in batches, they suit celebrations perfectly. One tray becomes several. Several become tins, platters, parcels, or exchange boxes. Flour dust settles on sleeves. Cut shapes gather on parchment. Cooling racks fill slowly. Handwritten recipe cards reappear from drawers. In some families, the same cookies return each year with almost the same scents, the same timing, the same small arguments about thickness, spice, or decoration. Repetition gives the cookie a kind of seasonal memory. Cookies are also deeply suited to gift-giving. A wrapped plate of cookies feels personal in a way many foods do not. It suggests effort without grandeur. It says someone stood in a kitchen, measured, mixed, watched the oven, and thought of another person while doing it. Even when the recipe is simple, the gesture carries warmth. A dozen cookies on a doorstep, a tin delivered at winter, a paper bag passed over a fence. These all turn baking into a form of social language. Church halls, bake sales, school events, community tables, and family reunions all make use of this same quality. Cookies are easy to transport, easy to display, easy to portion, and easy to sell or share. They work well in crowds because nobody has to commit too heavily to them. One is enough to begin. 2 or 3 can follow. They create abundance without demanding formality. A tray covered with cookies looks generous almost immediately. This may be why cookies became such strong foods of hospitality. They ask very little from the guest. To offer someone a cookie is a light gesture, but not an empty one. It creates welcome without pressure. It can soften silence. It can mark a visit, a pause, or a small reunion. In many homes, the question is not whether something elaborate can be served, but whether there is a little something sweet at hand. Cookies answer that need with unusual grace. Their social power also comes from their scale. A cake often belongs to a milestone. A cookie belongs to people. It can be handed directly to a child, tucked into a napkin for a guest, stacked for neighbors, or passed around a table where no one needs to wait for knives, plates, or instructions. The cookie fits human exchange. All of this helps explain why cookies remain so close to home, even as they spread more widely. For a long time, the image of the cookie was still tied to trays, tins, recipe cards, and domestic labor. But that would begin to shift. As baking changed in the modern world, cookies became easier to produce in great quantities, easier to package, and easier to recognize not just as homemade offerings, but as industrial products with familiar names and shapes. As baking entered the industrial age, cookies changed without losing their basic identity. They were still small, sweet, and easy to hold. But now they could be made in quantities far beyond the scale of the home kitchen. What had once depended on wooden spoons, family ovens, and individual trays began moving through mixers, conveyor belts, metal cutters, and packaging lines. The shift began gradually in the 19th century, as industrial food production expanded and cities grew. Larger populations needed food that could be produced more consistently and distributed more widely. Cookies were especially well suited to this world. Their small size made them easy to portion. Their relative dryness made many varieties stable enough to store and transport. Their popularity made them worth repeating at scale. Mechanical mixing changed one part of the process. A dough that once depended on hand labor could now be blended more evenly and in larger batches. Factory ovens changed another part. Instead of a household tray with a few dozen cookies, there could be rows upon rows moving through controlled heat. Cutting and shaping also became more standardized. A cookie no longer had to reflect the exact pressure of one person's hand or the slight unevenness of a home table. It could be repeated almost exactly, again and again. That repetition mattered. In the home, a cookie might vary slightly from batch to batch, and that variation could be part of its charm. In an industrial setting, sameness became a strength. A familiar cookie could taste and look almost identical from one town to the next. That kind of consistency helped build trust. If people bought a cookie once and liked it, they could expect roughly the same experience the next time. Packaging played a large role too. Once cookies could be sealed more securely, their reach expanded. A home-baked cookie often belongs to a short window of freshness. A packaged cookie, by contrast, can travel farther, wait longer, and sit on a shelf until needed. Tins, boxes, and later other forms of protective wrapping changed not only how cookies were stored, but how they were imagined. A cookie could now be both a domestic pleasure and a commercial product. The biscuit tin is a good example of that change. A decorative tin does practical work by protecting what is inside. but it also turns the cookie into an object of display and circulation. A tin can sit in a shop window, be given as a gift, or remain in a household after the cookies are gone, carrying the memory of them forward. It belongs partly to commerce and partly to the home. Factory baking also made certain cookie forms easier to spread widely. Sandwich cookies, uniform biscuits, crackers with sweet edges, and other standardized types became more common because machinery could produce them efficiently. A cookie that required close matching, even shapes, or steady thickness benefited from industrial precision. This helped create the mass familiarity of certain cookie types that might once have been harder to reproduce so evenly by hand. What changed most, perhaps, was accessibility. Cookies no longer had to be made in your own kitchen or bought fresh from a local bakery to be part of daily life. They could be purchased ready-made, carried home, packed for travel, placed in cupboards, or tucked into lunch tins. This gave them a broader social reach. Cookies became ordinary in a new way. They could belong not only to those who baked, but also to those who simply opened a packet. And yet the factory did not erase the home tray. The two continued side by side. One offered scale, consistency, and convenience. The other offered warmth, variation, and the lingering smell of baking in the room. There is no need to set them against each other too sharply. Industrial cookies made the form more widely available. Homemade cookies kept it intimate. In many households, both became normal. A packaged sandwich cookie might sit beside a homemade batch of oatmeal cookies without any sense of contradiction. This dual life may be one reason cookies stayed so durable in modern culture. They could live in the market and in the kitchen at once. They could be bought, gifted, stored, balled, baked, wrapped, and shared across many different settings. Industrial baking did not make them less flexible. It may have made them even more so. And once a cookie could be produced so easily, shipped so widely, and recognized so quickly, it also became easier to change. New flavors, new textures, new ingredients, and new cultural influences could all enter the form more freely, allowing the cookie to keep reinventing itself without ever really leaving its older identity behind. That ability to change may be one of the cookie's greatest strengths. Some foods stay closely tied to one form, one texture, or one set of ingredients. Cookies do not. They seem unusually willing to adapt. They can absorb new flavors, new flours, new social meanings, and new dietary needs without losing the basic quality that makes them recognizable. They remain small, finished, portable, and easy to share, even as almost everything else about them shifts. Part of this flexibility comes from the simplicity of the form itself. A cookie does not demand a single structure. It can be crisp or soft, thick or thin, plain or filled, heavily spiced or almost bare. It can be flour-based, nut-based, oat-based, or built around ingredients that would once have seemed unusual in a sweet bake. As long as it remains a small, self-contained baked thing, people are willing to understand it as part of the family. This has allowed cookies to move easily across generations. One era may favor very simple butter cookies. Another may lean towards soft centers and dark chocolate. Another may become interested in oat flour, nut flours, or less refined sweeteners. Yet the cookie survives each of these changes because it does not depend on one single recipe for its identity. It depends on a pattern. A small bake, often sweetened, often shareable, often tied to comfort. Dietary changes have made this flexibility even more visible. When people need or want alternatives, the cookie often becomes one of the first foods adapted. Gluten-free cookies can lean on rice flour, oat flour, almond flour, or other blends. Vegan cookies can shift away from butter and eggs while preserving enough richness and structure to still feel familiar. Lower sugar versions, higher protein versions, and allergy-conscious versions all show the same thing. The cookie bends more easily than many other baked goods. It is resilient because its essence is broad. Local ingredients keep shaping it too, just as they always have. In one place, sesame may enter the dough. In another, coconut. Somewhere else, matcha, tahini, cardamom, black sesame, miso, date paste, or regional nuts may become central. A cookie can carry local taste very gracefully because it never needs to be grand. A little flavor goes a long way in a small bake. This makes it an ideal form for cultural adaptation. It can reflect where it is made without becoming unrecognizable. That is why nearly every region can make something cookie-like out of what is already close at hand. Wheat may dominate in one place, rice flour in another, semolina in another, ground nuts in another. A cookie can be festive or plain, expensive or modest, modern or old-fashioned. It does not insist on one social class or one historical period. It belongs almost anywhere people are willing to mix something small, sweet, or gently savory, and bake it into a finished shape. There is also room inside the cookie for novelty, in a way that feels almost playful. People are often willing to try a new cookie flavor because the scale is so approachable. A whole cake in an unfamiliar flavor can feel risky. A single cookie rarely does. That smallness encourages experimentation. It allows new combinations to appear without much resistance. A cookie can carry nostalgia and surprise at the same time. And that may be the deeper reason it keeps being reinvented. Reinvention does not threaten the cookie. It renews it. New generations can make the form their own without breaking the thread that connects them to older bakers. A modern cookie filled with new flavors still belongs to the same broad history as a spiced honey biscuit or a butter-rich shortbread. The ingredients may shift, but the human impulse remains steady. Make something small. Make it good. Let it carry feeling. This coexistence of nostalgia and invention is unusually important. Some cookies are treasured precisely because they do not change. A family recipe may be protected almost like a memory. At the same time, bakeries, home cooks, and food cultures continue pushing the form into new territory. The cookie manages to satisfy both instincts. It lets people preserve and experiment without choosing only one. That is a rare kind of durability. The cookie survives because it is not rigid. It can belong to tradition without becoming trapped by it. It can take on new ingredients, new textures, and new meanings, while still feeling deeply familiar. And after all of that reinvention, one quiet question remains underneath the whole journey. Why has this small baked form lasted so well for so long? What is it about a cookie that allows it to hold together practicality, pleasure, memory, and change all at once? Perhaps the answer is that a cookie has always been more than one thing at a time. What looks simple on the plate is, in truth, the meeting point of many long human habits. A cookie can be practical and comforting. It can be ordinary and ceremonial. It can belong to the road, the market, the monastery, the family kitchen, the factory shelf, and the holiday table, without losing itself completely in any one of them. By now, the full shape of the story is easier to see. The cookie begins far from the modern dessert tray, in the older world of hard travel breads, small baked portions, and oven-tested dough. It passes through the sweetness of Persia, the movement of sugar and spice, the shifting names of biscuits and little cakes, the festive markets of Europe, the household adaptations of North America, and the chemistry of flour, fat, sugar, and heat. Along the way, it becomes fragrant, social, portable, giftable, and deeply familiar. It survives industrial baking without losing its place in the home. It welcomes reinvention without letting go of memory. That is a remarkable thing for such a small food to do. A cookie holds agriculture inside it, because grain had to be grown, milled, and worked into flour. It holds trade inside it, because sugar, spice, cocoa, nuts, and even certain techniques traveled across regions and empires before entering the dough. It holds chemistry inside it, because texture depends on moisture, protein, fat, browning, and air. And it holds care inside it, because for centuries, people have kept turning cookies into gestures of welcome, comfort, and repetition. This may be why cookies can feel so much larger than they are. They carry systems and feelings at once. A person can bite into one without thinking about any of this, and that is part of the beauty. The cookie does not demand that its history be known in order to be enjoyed. Still, the history is there, folded quietly inside the ordinary. And that brings us back to the question that drifted in at the beginning. Have cookies always been desserts? Not really, not in the modern sense. There have been too many other things for that answer to feel complete. They have been practical foods, ritual foods, medicinal foods, seasonal foods, travel foods, companion foods, beside cups and conversations. Dessert is only one of their later and more familiar identities. The cookie became a dessert partly because it was already so adaptable. It could move into that role easily, but it was never limited to it. What has remained steady is something simpler. People kept making cookies because they fit life well. They were manageable. They were shareable. They could be made plain or rich, soft or hard, festive or everyday. They could meet the needs of hunger, of hospitality, of memory, or of comfort. Few foods are so small and so flexible at the same time. There is also something calming in the fact that the cookie was never a grand invention. It did not arrive all at once in a flash of perfection. It emerged slowly from trial, need, adaptation, and repetition. It became what it is because generation after generation kept adjusting dough to suit the world around them. A little more sweetness here, a new spice there, better access to butter, a different flour, a hotter oven, a paper recipe card, a factory line, a family tin. Quiet changes one after another until the cookie seemed to have always been there. And now, at the end of the story, it is easy to return to the simplest image of all. A tray resting in the kitchen after the oven has gone quiet. The cookies have finished their spreading and setting. The surface has dimmed from shine to softness. The room is darker now, Somewhere, sugar and butter still linger faintly in the air. Nothing dramatic is happening. The heat is fading. The day is loosening its grip. A cookie cooling on a tray can seem like one of the smallest things in the world. But inside that stillness sits a very long human story. One made of grain, spice, trade, heat, memory, and care. And perhaps that is why cookies have lasted. Because something so small can be held in the hand, shared without effort, remembered without trying, and made again tomorrow.